of got it. Press that little button to stay in recording mode. So Gordon will take you on the virtual journey today, and later when we're out of lockdown, you'll have the on the ground journey to look at the precious nature and distinction between some of these plants and what they add to our rich environment. So I'll hand to my very competent and capable husband, and I look forward to being on this journey with you today. Thanks, Gordon.
Okay, well, thank you, Sandra, and welcome everybody. First of all, I think you can all see the screen of the presentation. Is that coming through? Because I assume it is.
Yes, Gordon, it is.
I'll start quick acknowledgement of my own. I'd like to acknowledge that this virtual meeting is meeting on the lands of the Bunyurong or Bunurong people, who are the traditional owners of these lands and waters, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to thank our Hobsons Bay Wetland Center partners, especially Hobsons Bay City Council. This is a thank you for all the work that they do to care for the country that we're talking about. And basically they help make what we do possible. This would have been our running sheet because we would have had a talk and then a walk. Now we're going to try to finish sometime around 10 o'clock. I hope I don't run too far over that. This is the map of where we would have walked to, but we still plan to do this. So it's something to look forward to. That marker there is the location of the meeting place, and we would have been walking to the Laverton Creek Saltmarsh. So if you're familiar with this area, that'll help. Otherwise, this talk is just background for a walk that we will do soon. Now, the purpose of this talk is to help people get more enjoyment out of our internationally significant salt marsh, just by providing some basic background knowledge. My theory is that we get more out of spending time in nature when we learn to notice things, and we see and notice more when we know a little bit about what we're looking at. And in the salt marsh, we're talking about some really sparse and lowly little plants that even I, as a nature lover, even I a few years ago never really noticed. It all to me just looked like scrubby little plants. But one of the things that helped me, and I'm not an expert, I'm still learning, but one of the things that helped me was just learning a little bit about what it is. To the point that now I think these little plants in the salt marsh are absolutely amazing and beautiful. I put in a slide about why is salt marsh important, but then I realized we're all allowed to have our own reason for why it's important. We have to remember that the first peoples, to them it's important because it is their country and it's the land where they fished and hunted traditionally. Here is a 21st century list of reasons why salt marsh is important, but this could be an entire workshop on its own. What this workshop is about is why is salt marsh the way it is? And I kind of boil it down to 4 factors. One is the plants that we have in Australia that are actually able to grow in the salt marsh. Salt and flooding in the environment are 2 really important factors that work together. And then also the forces that shape the coastline are like sort of the 4th most important factor. But of course, in all these things, I'm just kind of saying some simple principles that have helped me understand what's going on out there, but there's always so much more and lots of things that we'll never know, which is important to remember. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the plant species, because when you're trying to understand a habitat and environment, you start by trying to understand the plants. There actually isn't any talk in this, there isn't any part of this whole talk about animals, except for like that little crab on the first slide. It's all about the plants. And when we go for a walk, we've got these plant cards to try to help people learn to identify the common plants. And I'd like to point out that these are just the name of the plant and a picture. And then we also have these really great little guidebooks. We think they're perfect. If you look at, it says it's the Tasmanian Saltmarsh Wetlands Plant Guide, but it's just a wonderful guide that's just the right size. And it just turns out you could just cross out Tasmania and write Victoria, because the species are almost the same. If you went looking for mangrove in here, you wouldn't find it. But other than that, it's essentially like a Victorian guide. We've got a number of those, and we were going to have them at the workshop so that you could even buy one if you wanted to have one. But if you didn't, we also have these cards. So I'm just going to wait until we go on the walk so you can actually see the plants and just kind of talk a little bit about them before we see them, just kind of an overview. And the most important one to talk about is actually glasswort. So saltmarsh and glasswort. I came from America, so when I hear the term salt marsh, the word marsh, it makes me think of something with like grasses and rushes growing up out of soggy landscape. And in Australia, that's really not what it means. In Australia, the term salt marsh generally means a habitat that's dominated by this plant, this group of plants called glasswort. Now, the term glasswort is a very old term. It comes from medieval Europe, because turns out that glasswort became one of the very most important ingredients in glass making for centuries. So that's the origin of the name of the plant. And glasswort actually grows in these types of habitats all over the world. So you have glasswort dominated salt marsh in parts of Europe and Southern Asia and Eastern Asia, even though you might have seen lots of pictures of, say, American salt marsh, which is dominated by grasses. They're a pretty amazing group of plants, one of the world's most salt-tolerant groups of plants. And they're pretty strange looking as well, because they've got no leaves. They just have fleshy twigs that look like beads strung together. They come in all kinds of colors, and they have one of the tiniest flowers, which is just one petal, and it's like only about 1 millimeter long. So they basically just look like flecks of dust. And we have got 5 species of glasswort growing in our local area. If you don't remember any other species from this talk, then just remember this one. It's called beaded glasswort, and it's one of the most important plants in Australia, I would say, because it's one of the very few plants in the world that can actually stand being flooded with seawater twice a day. So that makes it the foundation species for our salt marsh all over Australia. And it can cover really large areas right at the tide line. Then if you don't remember more than 2 species out of this talk, remember this one, which is another type of glasswort called shrubby glasswort, which, unlike the beaded glasswort, which you can see in the foreground in the picture, shrubby glasswort actually gets some height to it, can grow maybe chest high, which is huge for a glasswort, because it's got like woody stems. It's almost like I call it the redwood of the glassworts. So you might think I sound like I've forgotten all about mangroves, right? Because this is another species that can stand being flooded by salt water twice a day, and it's woody, but it's just not the dominant species in the Laverton Creek salt marsh. And it could be an entire topic. It's an entire ecosystem on its own. So in Australia, we tend to differentiate between salt marsh, and then by that term, we mean glasswort dominated habitats and mangrove habitats. They will grow together side by side, but this talk, we're gonna not talk very much about mangroves. There are lots of other kinds of succulents. Glassworts are succulents. There's lots of other kinds in the salt marsh. There isn't like a succulent family. These are all plants which have evolved succulents on their own. But they're some of the most interesting and beautiful plants. And here's just a couple of my favorites. Austral sea blight, which is all over the salt marsh and which comes in all kinds of amazing colors. So this is what it looks like in the autumn along Laverton Creek, and it's why I call it the rainbow bush, because it goes everything from like aqua blue to like bright purple. And this is another really great species in terms of color. It's the rounded noonflower, which can be all kinds of different colors from, well, green to red, but in the salt marsh, it can form these really great red necklaces. And then there actually are plenty of species of grasses and rushes in the salt marsh. It's just that they do not dominate really at the edge of where the tide meets the land. But there are quite a few varieties, which you'd see more of as you walk inland, like if you walk up Laverton Creek and get into more fresh water. And then there actually are some just grasses. Actually, out of all the grasses in Australia, including the introduced species, there's actually lots of species of grasses that have salt tolerance, and they could grow really close to the salt marsh. But there's only a small number of grasses that can actually tolerate the salt in the salt marsh. So, and these are a couple of those. And then there are some grasses and sedges that form tussocks. If you're familiar with this term, a tussock is a big clump of grass. So this is the spear grass growing in the salt marsh. And this is a landscape dominated by a type of sedge that called Gania, or chaffy sausage, which is also a type of salt marsh. So you can see there's actually a wide variety of landscapes that we call salt marsh. Then there's quite a few species that we tend not to notice, but like little wildflower species. Some of them have little like white star-like flowers that you can see in the spring. And just a few of them, well, this one on the left is called Laurentia, and it is unusual because it sends up this really tall spike, even though it's like a little low plant. And that is sort of an overview of the plants that we've got in the salt marsh. We also have cards to take on the walk for vegetation classes, which is like a type of habitat. And there are a number of habitat types that have been classified by environmental scientists and even given numbers, as you can see. So this can become really useful in understanding the landscape and learning what plants to expect. So that's just a quick overview about the plants of the salt marsh. Are there any questions at this point?
Gordon, I just wanted to say that that book that you were talking about is available on the Eventbrite if anyone wants to buy it from there for $15. So if that's an easy way for you to buy that, and then you can get your copy on the walk if that works for everyone.
Could you hold it up? Because we couldn't quite see it when you first held it up, Gordon.
Okay.
A bit higher.
I didn't really expect you to be able to see it really well, but it's
Just a bit higher.
A bit higher.
It's meant to be a field guide. So it's a little, really accessible field guide to exactly the type of habitat we're talking about.
And you're trying to talk him into doing a Victorian one. Is that right?
Yes, I'm quite sure we should be able to do that. So
who is that?
Vishnu Prahlad is a Tasmanian professor who's one of the country's experts in salt marsh and salt marsh conservation. And I've been talking to him, and I believe we can very easily get a Victorian version of the book if we're willing to help him a little bit.
Does anyone else have any questions for Gordon at this point?
I have a quick one. All of your photographs, Gordon, can you tell us about the pictures that you've sourced?
Well, I've tried to make a presentation using our own photographs. Some of them are off the internet, but we're building up a library of our own photos. So most of them are taken either at Laverton Creek Salt Marsh or Truganina Swamp.
And another follow-up question. Those
That
tiny
one on
ones.
the screen right now is taken by you.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. The tiny white flowers that you showed, how tiny are they? And if between now and when someone goes out and has a walk, given that you said that they're in spring, would they see them now? How long would they be in flower, and are they easy to spot because they are really tiny?
Well, those little salt marsh herbs, there's one species called Frankinia that grows right along the creek, and then there's other species where you have to go along the nature trails back away from Laverton Creek. And if you're out walking in Altona Meadows in the dry salt marsh, you will see it, and they will be starting to bloom in a few weeks from now. They're about they're just a little less than a centimeter in size, and we're not talking about one species. There's a few species there.
I think we're ready to go on to the next part. Thanks, Gordon.
Okay, so the next section is all about salt in the landscape. And so planet Earth is an amazing place because we've got, salt in the ocean, and we've got salt flats and salt lakes. There's even such a thing as salt glaciers, believe it or not. So this is the Jashik Salt Dome in Iran, which is a salt glacier, one of many. And that's salt, pure salt, hundreds of meters thick, extending for hundreds and hundreds of meters as far as the eye can see. So it's just, salt is a really natural part of lots of landscapes. And yet even though salt's been around for millions of years, land plants have done a really terrible job of adapting to it. So salt is still one of the quickest and surest ways to kill land plants. And the reason is because land plants have this really special scheme that they use to live, where they just get the nutrients and water to hop right out of the soil into their roots and go all the way up to their leaves. And it's hard to kind of adjust or compromise on that. And salt completely disrupts that. So here's an experiment you may have done in science class when you were young. You take something like lettuce or onion or some other green, and you look at it under a microscope, and then you make a solution of salty water, put it on, look at it under the microscope again, and you just see the cells completely collapse. Or they don't completely collapse because plant cells have got a rigid cell wall. But if it weren't for that cell wall, they would just crumple up like little plastic bags that are being thrown away. So actually everything important in the cell has completely shriveled up inside. All the water and nutrients have gone out of the plant into the salt water, because the water with a solution will equalize its solution across a cell membrane without the cell membrane having to do any work. So great in normal soils, disastrous in salty soils, because now if you're a plant, instead of getting watered by the soil, your roots are watering the soil, and you've got no way to reverse that. But a few species of plants in the world have learned how to reverse that. First of all, there are seagrasses, which they're just totally unbelievable. They're land plants that have learned to live like seaweed. But just talking about land plants that grow on land, the term for land plants that have evolved salt tolerance is halophytes. And there's not a family of halophytes either. There's lots of different kinds of plants that have developed salt tolerance. And then there are some groups where it's become one of their main features, like glassworts and saltbush. And the way they've adapted are many, and they tend to be really small anatomical adaptations that you might not even see or notice. But there are different strategies so that the plant can reverse this real disadvantage of having salt in the environment. Glassworts actually take salt into their tissue, but even that's a problem because salt is toxic once you've brought it into the organism. But glassworts are very successful. Instead of losing water in salty environments, they can actually keep pumping water into their tissue, even when it's like saltier than seawater. Another thing about our halophyte or salt resistant or salt tolerant species is that they don't love salt. They don't need salt to survive. What they're doing is figuring out how to survive even though they're under stress. They can stand more stress than other species, so they prevail in salty environments. They'll also grow where there is no salt, but they won't be as competitive there, so they'll never take over. So they can survive stress, and then in some areas where the level of stress goes up, or at certain times when it goes up, they're adapted to just they're evolved to just continually adapt to the level of salt, so that in some cases, they end up looking like they're barely surviving. They end up looking really sickly, sometimes for really long periods of time. Like this is beaded glasswort, and it's actually lost its succulence. It looks like it's dying because the twigs have gone white. They're still alive, but they're not doing photosynthesis anymore. They are probably responding to more stress than your healthy green beaded glasswort is experiencing. And you'll see this in the salt marsh. The salt marsh sometimes looks kind of sickly, and you see lots of examples of death and decrepitude, as I say. But that is actually quite natural with salt tolerant plants. Here's a little illustration off of the Wikipedia page for brackish water. Just to make the point, there's lots of different levels of salinity that we're talking about. We just tend to use the term saline for if the salinity is around seawater, brackish if it's less, hypersaline if it's more, and we use the term for both water and land. So for example, there are brackish grasslands in Victoria. And it's kind of worth talking about. It's not really changing the subject, kind of relevant to point out that we have a heritage in this area of salt as an economic factor in Laverton and Altona Meadows, because Cheetham Wetlands takes its name from Cheetham Salt Works, which began construction in 1924 and operated until the 1990s. And this by Cheetham Salt, which ran a salt concentration operation out there in the salt marsh. Now, salt harvesting, salt concentration is one of the oldest industries in human history. What you want to do is you get some really flat, inexpensive land that you can flood with seawater, and you make big ponds so that you can take in a lot of seawater and then let it evaporate. So your water's getting saltier, but as it's evaporating, you're wasting the capacity of your big pond. So you move the water to a smaller pond, and where the concentration's higher. And as that evaporates, you move it onto a smaller pond, so that eventually you've got a pond that you're going to allow to completely dry out. So you've got crystalline salt on the ground and you can scrape it up. So those ponds are still there today in Cheatham wetlands. These are the medium-sized ponds, and the smallest ponds where they actually scrape the salt were up around in what's now sanctuary lakes, because Cheatham Salt Works became Sanctuary Lakes and Cheatham Wetlands National Park. So the infrastructure, the ponds that were created are still there, but now the entire area is managed for the benefit of wildlife, and the ponds and the pipelines are still there, and the fact that the Park Service can use them to move water around is actually benefiting wildlife. So when Cheatham wetlands, when Cheatham concentrated salt into ponds, it created what we would call hypersaline mudflats. So the salinity is much higher than seawater. But hypersaline mudflats, they form naturally in salt marsh anyway, without any help from humans. So this is a picture of natural hypersaline mudflats. Tells you two things. One is you can't just assume that salt levels are just the same everywhere in the salt marsh. There are actually lots of complex things going on, like this area where the salt is being concentrated. And the other thing is, you can see hardly anything can grow there. Gray glasswort is just a really heavy duty kind of glasswort, but even it is growing under stress conditions. So this plant could grow to be a bush like 1/2 meter high. Here, it's barely able to grow at all. It's going to spend its entire life growing extremely stressed. So because we're talking about salt in the landscape, I just want to quickly say that salt is actually a factor in landscapes all over the place. It is by no means strictly a coastal thing. So for example, this is a moderate saline area in the middle of a farm. And salt can show up at different places in the landscape in ways that are really hard to understand, because salt can travel long distances. It can disappear and go into the ground, and then it can reappear years later. And you're probably aware that this is a factor in lots of places in Australia. Australia on a whole is a moderately salty place. From on this map, places from yellow to orange would be places where salt is hidden in the landscape, but it's there. And from orange to red would be places where it's affecting the landscape. And the reddest places, well, they tend to actually be wetlands. So those internal wetlands with high salt levels, we call those salt marsh as well. We call that inland salt marsh. And if you pay attention to coastal salt marsh and you take a road trip and visit inland salt marsh areas, it should look familiar, because inland salt marsh in Australia is areas dominated by glasswort and fringed by saltbush. So Australia is actually a bit of a evolutionary hotspot for glassworts and saltbush. And this is just an interesting connection between the coast and inland. And inland areas actually have greater biodiversity than our coastal salt marsh. So that's a really quick overview of how salt is a factor determining why salt marsh is the way it is. Are there any questions? Now, if we had been meeting in the at the explosive preserve and we had like a 3-hour time slot, I wouldn't be so worried about finishing right bang on 10, but I'm a little bit conscious of the time.
Yep,
Can we see any hands up? Can you see them, Chris?
Oh, I'm looking at my
chat on as well.
PowerPoint screen, but just shout them out. Or hang on,
unmute yourself,
I'll
guys.
get back to this view.
I'll jump in because I've always got questions about everything.
Hmm.
Have you considered, Gordon, sea level rise? And we talk about that a lot with climate change, and we've got some very sensitive habitats that are salt tolerant. What happens with sea level rise to this habitat?
Well, see, salt marsh should be the one habitat in the world that we don't worry about, because you've got these plants that are adapted to seawater flooding. And obviously, you know, as sea levels have changed in the past, salt marsh has just tracked the sea level, the coastal change, right, as coastlines change. In places where saltwater rise is already killing off less salt tolerant plants, like those, you know, like those ghost forests in America, that's a place where salt marsh will be filling in to replace it. However, salt marsh is still endangered because we either don't preserve it, or we've created situations where it's going to be difficult to preserve it in spite of its extreme adaptability.
I have one to Gordon about dieback. Is that related to salt encroaching, or is that something else? Do you know?
Oh, that slide that I showed earlier, like dieback in America?
Yeah.
Because I had a slide of a ghost forest, and that's actually happening in a lot of places, particularly on the east coast of America, where forests close to the ocean are just suddenly dying. And it is related to so many things, right? Because there's so many factors, as we'll see in the next section, actually, because it could be the saltwater encroaching, or it could be that we've stopped as much fresh water coming down the rivers, right? It could be any number of things, but it is actually becoming a bit of an environmental problem in America.
Thanks.
And will be soon here too, I suppose.
Already is in places.
I'm conscious of time, but and I can't see if other people have questions, but you said there's no wild other like animals in this presentation. It's all about the plants, but will you be talking any more about, this is an ecosystem, so what kind of other species are dependent upon the salt marsh? And maybe you'll cover that. I don't need an answer now, but just wondering.
No, not covering that so much. I've got these slides that talk about salt and flooding, because they're like the main factors that helped me understand why we have different kinds of salt marsh in different places. And we're just kind of, it's just a broad brush, quick overview, really. But salt marsh is important. So salt marsh on the coast protects other ecosystems further inland. There's so much there that we could talk about. Salt marsh also protects marine habitats from what's coming into the water from the land. So salt marsh is very important.
That's it, I think, Gordon. Thank you. We'll keep moving.
Okay, well, I'll just keep rolling. The next section's on flooding. So salt and flooding work together, but let's just talk about flooding. This is also from Wikipedia on the page about salt marsh. It just shows a really simple concept. I remember seeing it in books growing up in America. It applies anywhere in the world. Salt marsh has a structure to it. Suppose your tide from high tide to low tide is, say, 2 meters. When it's 1 meter up from low tide, you've got a point that's underwater 50% of the time. And basically nothing will grow there, because what can survive being exposed 50% of the time and underwater 50% of the time, maybe deep underwater. But at some point, you're going to get to the point where it's shallow and flooding twice a day, and something can survive there. And then a little bit higher up, it's flooded twice a day, but for less time. So the plants will, over time, sort themselves out. So they will go from most flood tolerant to least flood tolerant, marching uphill. And we call the bottom of that the low marsh, and the top of that the high marsh. So it's a very simple concept that you can see all over the place. So here's Laverton Creek, and you can just see that whole principle at work. You have this huge area of bare mud, because that's, that's the area that plants can't grow, but it's very, very important, the bare mud. Then we've got, say, 1 to 2 meters of beaded glasswort. Then we've got the rainbow plant, Austral sea blight. Then we've got Frankinia that you can't really see. And then we've got Distychlis, the salt grass. And it's like bands, and just runs right up the creek. So you get this anywhere land, the seawater touches land, and you might get really skinny ribbons, like only 1 or 2 meters wide of salt marsh going up our estuaries. And we have that all over Victoria. And they're very important habitats. They get overlooked because they're long and skinny. But then there's our large areas of salt marsh, which are really flat. They don't even have a low marsh, high marsh. They don't even have a gentle kind of uphill. It's just large areas of complete flatness. And so that whole pattern doesn't really apply here. There's something more complex at work. And what happens is, instead of the banded pattern, you get these amazing patterns that I call mosaics. And we want to talk about that as well, because that's like what Cheatham wetlands and other places exhibit. But how does it work? Well, one thing you can say is it's so complex that basically every different salt marsh is unique. You get different patterns, and it just shows you how flat landscapes can be really interesting. Everybody loves mountains, but I've learned to love flat landscapes because you get these great fractal patterns and interesting feedback systems that you would not get, but you get because in a flat landscape, really minor things can have a huge impact. So how do we understand that? Well, I think it helps to imagine a starting point, like a blank canvas. And I don't know how often in nature you would get a blank canvas, but let's imagine a place that's just all mud, right? And probably at one point in time, Cheatham wetlands in Altona Meadows might have been like this, because scientists currently believe that sea level, that the bay filled in very quickly at one point. So it would have just killed everything. You have this big area of mud. What's going to happen? Well, on the edges or somewhere, you've got this species, beaded glasswort, which is capable of growing on that mud, even though it's being flooded by the tide. So eventually that will start to take over. And we call that a wet salt marsh herbland. That's just the term. It's actually one of those EVCs. So those cards, that's a name for, it's basically a name for almost pure beaded glasswort. There's very few other species that will be mixed in. And it grows right on the mud. And after it gets established, you might get these little embankments, like along the back here. but that's just like 15 centimeters high. So if like from the bottom of your channel to the top of your tallest glasswort, it's a very flat landscape. It's only like 30 or 40 centimeters at the most. And when you look at the satellite photos that I've been showing, you can spot the wet herbland saltmarsh, the wet saltmarsh herbland, because it's red, because the beaded glasswort has red colors or purpley colors most of the year. So you can see very plainly here, this is off of Swan Bay, down on the Bellarine Peninsula. So this would be an area where it was very flat, but the beaded glasswort has pioneered and established itself, and now it's still flooding, but the flood is now confined to channels. So it's starting to be a more complex system. It's not just the flooding influencing the vegetation, but now the vegetation is also influencing the flooding. And then eventually, if the beaded glasswort has started to collect soil underneath it, or it's raised up a bit, it's starting to dry out and enrich the ground so that other species will be able to grow there. And what you'll get is you've got some Frankenia that you can barely see, and you've got these bushes, which are the shrubby glasswort. And then you can see eventually you just get lots of the shrubby glasswort because the soil has been prepared for it. And an area of shrubby glasswort is called a wet saltmarsh shrubland. So that's another EVC, and that's almost pure shrubby glasswort. So this is Mud Island, very flat landscape out in the middle of the bay, where I think you can see that happening. You've still got the open mud and regularly flooding open mud, the tidal lagoon, and then you've got the beaded glasswort, and then you've got the shrubby glasswort. And then this is the old growth forest. This is an area where that process of the shrubby glasswort filling in has gone on for a long time. And this is actually our own Laverton Creek saltmarsh. And I call it the old growth forest to emphasize how precious it is, because it's only a remnant. Most of the rest of it's been cleared by the creation of the salt works. And it's also an example of how the mosaic forms, because this has been going on for so long that there's no more tidal flooding here, but it's still flooding, but that flooding is coming from rainwater. And the old channels are still there, but they're like cut off now. They're channels to nowhere. And the old patches of low salt marsh, herbland salt marsh, are still there. But they've gone funny, right? They're all unique. So there's some that are round, and then you've got, this one's got a tail on it for some reason. And this one's actually kind of like a donut. It's got a bear around it, and this one's got an island of vegetation in the middle, because it's a flat landscape, and any little thing in the landscape could affect the way water flows and accumulates. So they're all becoming different. Now, some of these little wetlands in the wetlands will become permanently flooded or frequently flooded. So that makes them very different. That's a habitat we call a saline aquatic meadow. It's just, it's cut off from the ocean, but it's still filled with aquatic plants. If an area became permanently dry, then that is still salty, but that allows plants with very low flood tolerance to fill in, and you get these really great meadows of salt tolerant plants. And this is where you get those little star-like wildflowers. And then you have the areas where the salt has concentrated. And how does that happen? Well, it actually tends to happen at the back of the salt marsh, where you get flooding coming through, but maybe it's coming through little tiny channels, or it's actually going underneath the shrubby glasswort. So it's flooding in occasionally and then never getting flushed out. And if that happens long enough, even if it doesn't happen very often, salt comes in, never gets flushed out. That's what concentrates the salt. And you get these areas where only the very most salt tolerant plants can grow. So that's a mosaic, right? Lots of little pockets that are different. Then if you have fresh water flowing through your salt marsh, which we do get, it's actually really common in nature, right? Like all our salt marsh areas in Hobson's Bay have got freshwater creeks coming out through them. In the case of Laverton Creek, it's a man-made creek. It's been dug, but it still illustrates the same principle. And it's actually good because it's got a walking path up the whole way. So you could actually take a walk all the way from the mouth of the creek, all the way up to where the salinity in the creek has gotten to really weak brackish. And obviously you're going to see change. So at the mouth of the creek, you've got these species that we've already talked about. Let me just, that's your beaded glasswort, right? And it's growing right at the mouth of the creek, along with your austral sea blight and your frankinia and a few mangroves. And so we'll just put them here. We're just talking about the plants right at the water's edge. Those plants will be dominant, and they'll actually continue all the way up the creek, but they don't dominate all the way up the creek. So as you get further up, you start to see other species. The first one that I've noticed is before you even get to the bridge, there's just a few patches of this plant called, actually, I shouldn't have drawn on the creek because now I've got this red line. I don't know how to get rid of it. This is called, well, it's Celeria radicans. It's a shiny swamp mat. It loves to grow on the edges of estuaries. So there's just a few, its first patches are pretty low down the creek. But then once you get past the bridge, you start to see more species. This is called streaked arrowgrass. And it's, again, it grows right at the water's edge and can tolerate salt, but it not full on sea level, saline level salt. This is called sea rush. It's a type of tussock that can actually take over really large areas, but it doesn't want the full level of salt, but it can tolerate flooding. And then this is called Bulboschonis caldwellii. It's another kind of rush, you could call it, but it's lower and it's growing right in the water. And then eventually you get to patches of what we're all familiar with, what we just call them reeds, Phragmites. And well, eventually this is what will fill in the creek as you get up higher. And it tolerates brackish water, but it probably tolerates the least salt out of all these species. So as you walk up Laverton Creek, if you actually wanted to walk up Laverton Creek and look at the water's edge, you have to be very careful because the path isn't really right there. You have to be careful of snakes. It's not a thing, but what I'm saying is the species right at the water's edge, or if you take, say, the first closest 1 or 2 meters at the water's edge, there will be at the start no more than 7 species, and then by the time you get up to Truganina Swamp, you've got over 24 species. So moving away from the sea and moving away from the source of flooding and away from the source of salt, you get diversity and you get a mosaic. And Truganina Swamp is an example of that. But this is the Barwon River. This is a really majestic example of that, because I think you can see just from this picture, it's an incredible mosaic of even more kinds of salt marsh than we've talked about, more types of EVCs, habitats that flood for a long time, but not very deep, or they flood for a short time really deep, or they have a lot of salt or not very much. Actually, the Bellarine Peninsula and around the Barwon River is one of the most important biodiversity areas in the entire country because of this. And I just wanted to talk about where the salt marsh ends, but we're actually kind of short on time. It's actually 10 o'clock already. So are there any questions on that?
There was a few questions that came through the messages, Gordon.
Okay.
One was, Gordon, could you talk a bit more about how certain kinds of plants prepare the area for another kind of plant, for example, more shrub-like plants? From Anne.
Okay, well, the different species have different salt tolerance and flooding tolerance. So the thing that's preparing, say, the land right at tide line, there's basically one species that can grow there, the beaded glasswort. So the thing that prepares that for other species is the fact that the beaded glasswort dries out the soil. It creates and it enriches the soil. But then in other areas, the plants might be limited by their tolerance of flooding. So the shrubby glasswort is preparing areas for dry salt marsh species because it's like a barrier. You know, these bushes, they're very woody bushes, so their root system is woodier. And when the shrubby glasswort gets into the salt marsh, it's really channeling the water and blocking the flooding of the water. So it's the areas behind the shrubby glasswort stop flooding, and they can, you know, so because it's flat, a plant that's filled in one area could actually be benefiting another plant that's hundreds of meters away. And the change that might dry out a little pocket of salt marsh might be at the mouth of a little tiny creek. So it's all very complex, but there's little different levels of tolerance, so that no matter what the conditions end up being, there'll be some kind of species that can get a toehold in there.
Thanks for that. Would that include pollution as well? It's stopping a lot of pollution coming through there by doing that as well, a lot of the salt marsh?
I think in general, you can say that wetlands do protect other wetlands and other habitats from pollution. So if, you know, whichever area is exposed to the pollution first, if that area can withstand some pollution, it will often trap it and stop it from going to another area. Whereas, I mean, this is the reason why we build freshwater wetlands in our new housing developments, so that those wetlands can protect other wetlands. But then again, there's no plants anywhere that have evolved to, you know, handle pollution. There are just species that are good at handling poor conditions. And these salt marsh species, because they have generally got this wide range of stress that they will tolerate, are often more able to handle poor conditions than a lot of other species.
Thank you. Does anyone else that have any other questions? Just answer anyone with their hand up. Just unmute yourself if you do.
I've got a
Okay,
question.
look. Yeah, okay.
It's Anne here. You showed us those great looking cards at the beginning, the cards of the different plants and conditions. Are they available to purchase, or who developed the cards?
Gordon.
Oh, I developed the cards, and they we take them on walks, and we will distribute them when we get to the point where all the pictures in them are our own IP. And we should get to that point soon. At the moment, well, actually, I think they're all either public domain or our own pictures. So we probably would be able to distribute them, but haven't made a practice of distributing them yet. But that's the goal. You know,
Right.
you could even print them out yourself.
Okay, guys, if nobody's got any other questions, just want to say that thanks for.
Hello, sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, it's
Yep.
Gillian here. I was just wondering if any of the plants are edible.
I could probably answer that.
Okay.
Yeah, most of them are. Most
Oh,
salt
okay.
plants are generally edible, especially the sea bright and a couple of the other ones. Actually, there's which was that one that you said, Gordon? The sea beans.
Look, the beaded glasswort you
Beaded
can actually
glasswort.
buy in a jar because it's become a bit of a gourmet food. The Austral sea blight, the Carcala, I think as some of them are catching on, they're experimenting with selling even more of them. Saltbush, the coastal saltbush. It just so happens that, yes, a lot of those salt marsh plants are edible. Some of them you'd want to be pretty careful how you cook them, not because they're poisonous, but because they actually taste a bit disgusting. But you can buy them and from gourmet websites, and I'm sure they are. If you paid $60 a kilo for them and you take them out of a jar, I'll bet they taste pretty all right.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? All right. Okay, I'd like to thank Gordon for today. I think it was a great talk. I think we all really enjoyed it. But we'll wait for COVID now to tell us when we can actually take you guys for a walk in this area. Hopefully it won't be too much longer before we know whether that 22nd date is the date that we're out and about. But we'll be in touch soon after that, so we can work out a date that suits everyone to go on this 2-hour walk. I know we're all looking forward to it. So thanks for all coming along today, and we hope to be in touch soon. I will send out a bit of a feedback form, and if Gordon, if you've got anything I can send on that email as well. Hopefully also a link to this recording, if we can get that sorted in time.
If I could just say, Chris,
Yes, yeah.
that in the meantime, while you're out, look closely and tread lightly.
Okay, so thank you guys. We'll see you very soon, I hope. Good luck in COVID lockdown. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye now.
Bye.
Well done.
Thanks all.
Good to go.